This is a revision video for resistance to social influence, and on the spec it includes social support and locus of control. And so the whole of this particular part of the specification is saying, why is it that some people can resist the pressure to obey or resist the pressure to conform, as in the man that you can see on the screen there. Everybody else, the majority, is doing something, and yet he is conspicuously not joining in, and that would have been a really significant thing. So that's what we're looking at, and the specification identifies those two reasons for why people are able to resist conformity and obedience, and those are social support and locus of control. So just to reiterate, if you get a question that says something like discuss explanations for resistance to social influence, then they're looking for social support and locus of control. If they ask you for one, then just pick one, but quite often they'll give you the choice or ask for both. So first of all, social support. This is a situational explanation for why people resist. And it's saying that the people that you have around you are going to help you resist that pressure to obey or conform. And so what we'll do is we'll look at what we've already done before in this unit. So we're going to look at Ash's variation and Milgram's variation. So Ash did a 3-line study, and when he did the variation called unanimity of the majority, that was also called the lone dissenter study, because there was a lone dissenter, so one person who went against the majority, and Ash wanted to see what would happen if one person went against, like one Confederate who's in on the experiment went against the majority, what would happen to the participant? So if you remember, the original baseline for conformity was 36.8% in the original study, and when the lone dissenter gave the correct answer, conformity dropped to 5.5%. But also interestingly, when they gave an incorrect different answer, it dropped to 9%, which is a huge drop in conformity. And so Ash concluded that it was the breaking the unanimity of the majority that was important. Basically, when you've got someone on your side, when you've got social support or an ally, then that will give you power to go against the majority, even if that other person doesn't necessarily say what you're saying. And so it is just having someone with you, having social support, that gives you psychological power. And then Milgram did a very similar variation in his obedience study, so the electric shock experiment. The original baseline level of obedience was 65%, but in the 2 rebel study, where 2 Confederate teachers refused to obey the experimenter sitting either side of our actual naive participant, then obedience dropped from 65 to 10%, which is a humongous drop in obedience. And again, it was that having somebody on your side to stand up against authority gives you the power to not do what you're being told as well. So these variations, you can use that in your AO1 description. These variations demonstrate that social support gives us psychological power to resist social influence. And so we're talking about both conformity and obedience in those cases. So the second explanation of why we resist social influence is a dispositional explanation, which means it's part of your personality. So Milgram's social support is situational, and saying the situation you're in, when you've got an ally, then you will resist. But the locus of control is saying that there's something about your personality that is going to help you resist social influence. So the researcher is called Julian Rotter. He's not named on the spec, but there he is in all his glory. And he talks about the locus of control. And he creates a questionnaire which you can take. I'll put a link in the description below, or if you're my students, then you can get it on MS Teams on the files section. So you can take the locus of control questionnaire, and it will show you whether you have something called either an internal or an external locus of control. And Rotter said that if you have an internal locus of control, then you believe that you control the consequences of your behaviour. Whereas if you have an external locus of control, then you think the consequences of your behaviour are outside of your control. So somebody with an internal locus of control is going to resist social influence because they're in charge of everything. They're in charge of their life. They're in charge of the consequences of their behaviour. So therefore, they're not going to feel pressured to go along with the majority, and they're not going to obey what other people are telling them to do because they want to influence their environment around them. If you have an external locus of control, you kind of think that life happens to you, and so therefore life is out of your control. The consequences of your behaviour are not within your control, and so therefore you're more likely to go along with the majority and you're more likely to obey orders. And if you might want to pause the screen there and just have a look at some of the characteristics of those internals and externals. This is just a snippet from that locus of control questionnaire, and as I said, you can download one either from MS Teams if you're my student, or there's a link in the description below. So, and this is just, if you have a look at this little picture, this is somebody with an internal locus of control, and just have a look at the arrows. The arrows are going outwards, and so the big star within them, that is their power that is influencing the world around them. So this person is saying, I determine my future. My passion and hard work help me achieve my goals, and they're in control. So they make things happen. So your internal locus of control kind of comes spilling out of you, and that affects the world around you, and you're making that happen. Whereas if you look at the arrows in this one, all the arrows are going inwards. Life is happening to this person. They are passive. The star, the passion is outside of them, and it is spilling inwards towards them. So they're not even saying things out loud. They're just thinking, there's nothing I can do about my future. Why am I going to bother trying? I'll just go with the flow and just rely on luck and fate. So therefore, someone with an external locus of control is more likely to go along with social influence like conformity and obedience. So a little bit of extra information that you could put if you've got an extended essay is the 3 A's of an internal personality. So these are the important characteristics that you would need to remember if you got asked why does an internal person actually manage to resist social influence? And it's because they are active seekers of information, they are achievement orientated, and they are able to resist coercion from others. And that means that they're going to resist social influence if they're active seekers of information, because they're going to find the right information to make an informed choice. So they're not just going to go along with the majority, they're actually going to seek information, and they're going to do what's right for them. If they're achievement orientated, they're more likely to be leaders and entrepreneurs. So they're more likely to be the ones giving the orders, and they're going to resist social influence. Leaders and entrepreneurs tend not to follow other people, and they tend not to, if they're told to do something they don't want to do, they're less likely to do it. So if they're achievement orientated, they're achieving their goals, they're more likely to be leaders and entrepreneurs. And then able to resist coercion. Coercion is where someone's trying to persuade you to go along with something, but in a very threatening way. So you better come with me and shoplift this, otherwise I'll break your legs, which is a very extreme example, but you get the gist. So someone who has an internal locus of control can resist that coercion from others. So they're not going to be persuaded by the people, even under pressure. And that means they're less likely to be involved in criminal activity as well. Next, we're going to look at the evaluation points for both social support and locus of control. So the first one, take a look at this woman here and see how thick her glasses are. Now, in the olden days, before we had amazing technology, the worse your eyesight was, the thicker your glasses. So back when Ash was doing his experiments, if someone wore thick glasses, that was an indication that they couldn't see very well. And remember, Ash told people they were taking part in a vision perception test. So this is about that social support does not have to be valid to be effective. And the fact that Ash he did a variation where he put a Confederate, a lone dissenter in, who had very thick glasses, meaning that the social support they were offering was invalid because they couldn't see very well. So what they found was that the best way to reduce conformity was to have a valid social support. But when they gave that Confederate thick glasses was invalid, they still found that was effective in helping participants resist conformity. So this suggests that social support does not need to be valid to be effective. It's that idea of having someone on your side that helps you resist conformity and obedience. So Ash was right. It was breaking the unanimity of the majority that holds great power in resisting conformity. So that is a strength of social support as an explanation. This is a criticism, and it's that the order of social support is a factor affecting resistance to social influence. So the theory says that if you've got social support, then you are going to resist social influence. However, the order in which the social support is provided appears to affect a person's ability to resist conformity. So in variations of the Ash experiment, the position of that lone dissenter who gave the different answer to the majority was altered. Condition 1, the dissenter answered first, and in condition 2, the dissenter answered fourth, just before the naive participant, and it was found that social support was actually more effective in position 1 than 4, and so it suggested that a correct first answer confirms the participant's own judgment, and that will endure even when others gave an incorrect answer. So when you are getting social support, if someone agrees with you straight away, you're like, yes, I knew it, and that person provides even more social support than maybe someone who comes along later and agrees with you, and you're like, do they really? Are they just saying it because I've said it? And it's not as effective. The next evaluation point is a strength for social support, and it's a real-world application of social support in resisting social influence. So it's called the Rosenstraße protest, and that picture there is actually from the film. It isn't from the actual thing, but it looks very, very lifelike. So a real-world demonstration of social support is from the Rosenstraße protest. Rosenstraße was the name of the street, Rose Street. And it was when German women were protesting in Rosenstraße in Berlin because the Gestapo, which was the Nazi secret police, were holding 2,000 Jewish men who were their husbands and children. And so the women were there protesting because they wanted to get their husbands and children back, and the Gestapo threatened to open fire if the women did not leave. And that was a really serious threat, but the women stood together. And when you really look into it, apparently they stood like arm to arm, toe to toe, shoulder to shoulder. They stood together, continuing their protest until the Jewish men were released. And it was the courage at risking their own lives, that courage came from having each other as social support. So in that case, very much, it was like they were psychologically there for each other and were able to actually overcome the orders to disperse from the Gestapo. Quite incredible. And then we've got a research support for locus of control as an explanation for resistance. So this was a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis found a positive correlation between scores of external locus of control and a range of measures of social influence. So this was saying a positive correlation: the more external you were, the more likely you were to obey or conform in a measure of, in many of those social influence situations. So externals were more easily persuaded, they were more easily influenced and more conforming than those who had high internal scores. And I've just quickly drawn a scattergram there just to give you a visual to think, yeah, so the more external you are, the more conformist you are, the more obedient you might be in many situations. And this is showing that an external locus of control means you're not going to resist social influence. And so on the flip, the internal locus of control will resist. Take a look at this lovely picture here. So I continued this, making this slide at home, where I somehow didn't have access to make beautiful looking scattergrams using the chart feature. So you've got my beautiful little diagram there, and it's showing two scatter graphs. So it says a positive correlation for locus of control and normative social influence was found, but not informational social influence. So with the locus of control, the more external, the more you would conform to normative social influence, but locus of control had no correlation whatsoever to informational social influence. And this is saying that locus of control is not always an indicator of whether people will resist social influence. And if you think about informational social influence, it means you're conforming to be right. And so perhaps even somebody with an external locus of control, they're able to look up the factual information, and so they're less likely to conform. But this is a criticism of locus of control, because locus of control says that you should, if you've got an external locus of control, you are going to obey and conform. And this is a criticism. It's saying, actually, that's not always the case. Sometimes we won't conform, I'm not an external, obviously, who knows? But it's saying that externals won't necessarily always conform or obey. Depends on the situation, so on the task. If the task involves something of informational social influence, then they won't. And the very last evaluation is evidence that in America, a meta-analysis found that the locus of control is becoming more external in young Americans. So the meta-analysis, obviously a study of studies, went from 1960 to 2002, and it was found that young Americans were becoming increasingly more external in that time. So see that little picture there of an alien? That's to represent the word alienation. And what they think, the reason that young Americans are becoming more external is because they're feeling more alienated. So when you feel alienated, you feel on the outside of society. Things are happening, you don't feel like a big part of it. You don't feel like you fit in, maybe. And so they think that increases in social change, such as rise in divorce rates, violent crime, and mental health problems, all those sorts of things have increased, and those things tend to happen to you. If someone steals your bike, that means you can't get to college and there's nothing you can do about it. And so people kind of give up. They feel powerless. People feel alienated. If your parents get divorced, you can't change that. You maybe don't want them to. But unfortunately, we have no say. We might fight and cry and put our point of view across, but you can't force people to still love each other in the way they used to. And so Twenge was saying that the increase in social factors meant that young people see many aspects of their life as out of their control, and so they're becoming more external. Now that is an observation. When we talk about evaluation, we're usually looking at strengths and criticisms, but this is just a pure discussion point. It's saying, look at what is happening in society. If anything, it's more of a sociological, dare I say, evaluation point. It's saying that society is influencing people's locus of control. Now that you have finished the listening all about how to resist social influence, it would be really useful for you to do something like meaningful, because you've probably listened to this and thought, yeah, I've got it, and yeah, I get those evaluation points, but you need to be able to remember them. So what I would recommend is, if you've got a little group of friends, then use them, get some study buddies, and then everyone can take one of the evaluation points each, create a beautiful, colourful A4 poster about that evaluation point, but write it in your own words, emphasise whether it's a strength or a limitation of either social support or locus of control. And then I've put there, create a memory peg for the evaluation point. And that means like put your own picture in, or a little rhyme, or invent a story, anything that will really make it stick in your mind. Then you're going to present your poster to the rest of your group, and then ask them questions about it. And if they can't answer them, explain your points some more. And then if you're in my class, what we'll do is I will photocopy a set of everyone's evaluation points, so then you've got all of those available. And directed study, and revision activities, make sure that you do something meaningful. So my students, you can download handout SP13, which is a good comprehension or test on locus of control and social support. And if you're not my students, then you can get a link for those in the description below. And then do those exam style questions. And the last one says discuss explanations of resistance to social influence. And so remember, when it says discuss, that is AO1 for 6 marks and AO3 evaluation points for 10 marks. And so you only really get like 3 marks to describe social support and 3 marks to describe locus of control. So you need to learn to really summarize those points, and then you can spend more time on the evaluation. You could try this stretch and challenge activity if you've got time. If it's near the exams, don't bother. But if you've got time, just to really reiterate it, you could try that. And those are your picture references.